Welcome to After Office Hours, the show where we sit down with Hillsdale professors to talk about topics in their area of expertise. Today we have on Dr. Adam Carrington to talk about the recent happenings with the Supreme Court. Dr. Carrington, thank you so much for being on.
Oh, pleasure to be here.
So my first question is, do you think that Donald Trump's nominee, Neil Gorsuch, do you think he's a good appointment for conservatives who are interested in the Supreme Court? Do you think that it's going to move the court in a more conservative direction?
That's of course the question that a lot of people were asking in deciding who to vote for in the fall, especially those who weren't maybe enthralled with Trump on other issues. I think, of course, the proof's going to be when he actually starts making decisions. The proof will be in the decisions themselves. However, I think there's a lot to make more textualist, originalist, even politically conservative people hopeful of what's going to happen. And a number of his lower court decisions point in a more conservative direction, or I would say a more textualist or originalist direction. The other thing I'd say, though, you asked, would it move the court? Actually, on most issues, not at all, because we've got to remember who is he replacing. He's replacing Scalia. So in many ways, if he proves to be the kind of judge that most people want, he'll be someone that keeps the court in its current balance.
So with that in mind, recently there has been some controversy in the Senate about some of Donald Trump's appointments to other positions within the federal government. There was a real stink raised over Betsy DeVos's appointment. Do you think that Democrats are going to mount a similar kind of opposition to the appointment of Judge Gorsuch, or do you think that this will be a sort of breezy, easy passage through the Senate?
Well, nothing's been easy lately, and I think it will continue to not be easy. I don't believe that, absent some turn of events, that it'll be as contested or close as, say, DeVos. And I think partly because I think the recent success getting through some of those nominees may force Democrats to scale back a little bit in their opposition, maybe not go full court press. The other is that I think Gorsuch is pretty supremely qualified, and I think that will be in his favor. His temperament, his qualifications, all that will make it a little harder to demonize him. And then third, I'd go back to what I said before. It's not he's not the judge that tips the scale on most issues. And I think that if the Democrats are thinking strategically, they're going to wait for when Kennedy retires, or especially if a Ginsburg or Breyer retire, all of which are very possible, even likely, in the next couple of years. That's the one that tips the scale that I think they would go full court press on.
So, do you think that Gorsuch, there have been some conservatives who have argued that Gorsuch is going to be more likely to oppose certain things that Donald Trump does with his textualist view of the Constitution. I know that even some Democrats have been saying that in private meetings with them, he's even in private meetings with them, he's been questioning some of the things that Donald Trump has been doing. Do you think that that will help him get through in the Senate, or do you think that that's largely going to be a non-issue?
I think in general it'll be a non-issue as far as determining votes, unless in trying to court other people by showing how he might differ from the president, he loses the confidence of the president. I don't see any of that happening. Now, will he make decisions that might go against the man who nominated him? Absolutely. In fact, he himself said that, and is famously quoted now as saying that if you always reach the results that you want to reach, then you're making a huge mistake. You're not being a good judge. The law should make decisions that sometimes go against your personal opinions. And I think with that, will he do things that President Trump might not agree with? Sure. But I think that's part of the separation of powers, as long as he does it faithfully within the powers of the judicial branch.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So a word that we've been using in our conversation thus far is textualist. I know that there has been historically some contention over that word, especially in conservative circles. I know that there was some disagreement between Justice Scalia and Justice Thomas about how to interpret certain aspects of the Constitution. Could you explain a little bit about that debate and where you think Judge Gorsuch might wind up in that debate?
Absolutely. That's a good question to ask. And I think textualism is part of the larger concept of originalism, which says that if you're going to have the rule of law, then how do you bind the interpretation of that law? You try to look as best as you can for what was the original meaning in some sort of way of that law as a way to bind its interpretation. And one way of doing so is to say, where do you start? And what should be the first most definitive thing? And Scalia was known as a textualist, meaning that he started with the text itself, that the actual text of the Constitution, the text of statutes, could actually answer a wide range of questions, and there wasn't a need to go to other parts. How would that approach differ from, say, Thomas? It's always interesting to watch where they disagree. I think that one would be that Scalia rejects a concept of natural law being underneath the Constitution, whereas I think Thomas says that it is one of the things that the Constitution looked to. I would say another difference in their textualism is when you go outside the text, when you say, okay, we've looked at the text and the text isn't clear, what other sources do we look at? And I think Thomas is willing to bring in a larger body of literature from the founding, including the Declaration of Independence, and consult a broader array of things that occurred during the founding or during a statute's composition to make those kind of determinations. So really the difference isn't in the respect one has for the text. It is when the text doesn't concretely by itself answer the question, what do you look at to sort of get the idea of what it's trying to get at?
Within that debate, do you think that Judge Gorsuch has done or has said anything, maybe in his opinions in those lower courtroom rulings that you were referencing, has he done much of anything to indicate where he may stand, or is that something that we're going to find out in coming months?
I think he's given some good examples based on his writing up to this point. We have to remember, he spent 10 years as a circuit court judge on the 10th Circuit out in Colorado. And he has commented on Scalia's work when Scalia passed away. And in doing so, he has said that he believes that by looking at the text and by looking at those things that contributed to the making of the text, whether that text is the Constitution itself or a statute, that we can actually get an idea of what the law's meaning is. And again, to repeat something I mentioned he said before, he has said if you always agree personally with the conclusion that you come to as a judge writing an opinion and voting in a case, you're probably doing it wrong, because the law should bind the judge in his personal opinions. And I think those are all promising as an approach that will make the judiciary, will make him a judge that looks at the judiciary as fulfilling its particular powers and not usurping those of other parts. Yeah.
So there are several big contentious court decisions that have been made over the past several decades that conservatives often have very strong personal opinions about.
Sure.
The Obergefell decision is a good example of one that legalized gay marriage across the country. Roe v. Wade is another one that many conservatives are very passionate about. On these particular issues, do you think that Gorsuch is going to take a stand that might make those conservatives happy, or do you think that he is going to perhaps be more like some of the other justices who sometimes disappoint conservatives on these issues?
It might depend upon their expectations. If they're looking for Gorsuch to be the vote that overturns Roe v. Wade, that overturns Obergefell, they will be disappointed. Not only, primarily again because there are already 5 justices on the court still who are in favor of those opinions. Again, Scalia was on record as being against both. He's replacing Scalia. It's also a question, and this is one where we'll find out how much like Thomas and how much like Scalia he is. Scalia is willing to give more respect to precedent, even if he thinks the opinion was originally wrongly decided. Thomas is much more willing to throw the precedent out if he thinks it's wrong. Will Gorsuch say, for the sake of the consistency of the law, we've already made these decisions even if he would have decided differently? That's not clear. That said, where can conservatives possibly take heart if they're wanting a decision that they like? It might be in the aftermath or the fallout of these two decisions. Gorsuch has at least shown some ability or some willingness to possibly protect religious liberty claims, which could be very important going forward in the fallout from Obergefell. Lots of those questions still remain completely undecided. And then with abortion, we've not had any abortion cases directly with him, but he certainly supported, seemed to support the state's ability or right to defund Planned Parenthood in a case just last year. He also has shown a willingness to, on issues of well, the book he wrote, I should say, the book he wrote on euthanasia, the way he articulated what life is and how life should be valued, makes it seem that even if he's not going to overturn Roe or be the vote to do so, that he would be in support of regulations of abortion going forward, that if states want to at least try to constrict abortion access or the way abortions are carried out, that he would be amenable to that.
I know that another debate that's been sort of raging in certain conservative legal circles is the ability of the Supreme Court to rein in certain aspects of the administrative state, that fourth branch of government of the executive agencies that aren't necessarily constitutional under a very conservative understanding of the document. And I know that some conservative legal scholars are of the opinion that the court should take a very active role in opposing those things. And I know that others think that the court should be more deferential towards Congress and towards the presidency. Has Judge Gorsuch indicated where he stands on that particular debate? I know that Donald Trump has has pledged to sort of go to war with certain aspects of that. Do you think that that the appointment of Judge Gorsuch is a step in that war? What do you make of that?
I think it is, given some of his opinions, he's been actually fairly clear that he is willing to push back against administrative deference. And really, that comes from two judicial doctrines where the courts have, and he actually says, have abdicated their responsibility to be judges, which is a pretty harsh attack on his own branch. And that is, one, the non-delegation doctrine. He has questioned the non-delegation doctrine, its abdication, by saying that there was a particular opinion where he said, we actually should say that this is an instance where Congress has given power to an executive agency and not given any intelligible principle to guide it. That's lawmaking power. That's giving up all their lawmaking power. Also, the doctrine of what's called Chevron deference, where courts have basically said that if an agency makes a claim about how a statute is to be interpreted and applied, as long as it's reasonable, and reasonable is an unbelievably low standard, then the courts must defer to it. And Gorsuch has an opinion that he wrote a few years ago that attacks that doctrine. And in fact, it attacks it even though Scalia tended to be in favor of that doctrine, and says in a fairly eloquent way that this is not how separation of powers works, this is not how the framers set up the system, and that it is non-constitutional aspects of government exercising legislative, executive, and judicial power. So those are all reasons to be fairly hopeful that even if he's not going to roll back the administrative state, that he is not going to allow it to go any further. But he himself said we need to revisit some of these things that I think would actually even be at least a partial pullback.
Are there any other important issues that conservatives should look to Judge Gorsuch's legal history and his opinions in those lower courts? Are there any other issues that you think are very important that Judge Gorsuch has taken a particularly strong stand on. What else does his record indicate going forward for conservative legal principles?
Well, I think we've hit some of the most hot button ones that have come up so far. At the same time, I'll say, I know among conservatives there's still ongoing debate about the death penalty. He seems to be a strong supporter of it. I know for some conservatives that's a plus, for some it's a minus. He is willing, as Scalia was, to protect the rights of criminal defendants. At the same time, I think he is willing to allow laws that are fair but tough on criminals to go through. So on some of those things, I think Donald Trump's emphasis on law and order, I don't see him as an enemy to well-written, strong law and order laws. I do see him as, if it crosses the boundary into a reasonable interpretation of the Fourth Amendment, that would be something where he could rule against the president, depending upon how those things play out in the particular details.
Are there any important Supreme Court cases coming up in the next few months that conservatives should have their eye on that may set a tone for the court's relations with the new Congress and the new presidency coming up in the next few months?
I don't think in the next few months that there are going to be major cases that will come up. And interestingly, with Gorsuch, he won't be able to participate in them. Really, we won't see any sort of Gorsuch effect till next year. If one of the executive orders, for example, the so-called travel ban, if it were to get up there, then that would be really interesting. But I think we're a ways away from that happening. I think basically, with the fact that the administration is so new and this Congress is so new, most of any important litigation that might come up is going to come up in the context of prior actions. It's going to take a little bit of time before we see what the relationship between the Supreme Court and this new administration and new Congress, what it's really going to look like.
Do you have any comments on some of the recent happenings in the Trump Justice Department? I know that there was recently a legal counsel who was dismissed by the White House. Do you think that do you think that they're setting a particular tone when it comes to how they're going to defend their actions? Do you think they're setting a particular tone when it comes to their interpretation of executive powers within the Constitution?
I think that on one hand, I think we're very, very early. And I think that some of the difficulties they've been having legally, in addition to, I think, some problematic interpretations of the Constitution by, say, the Ninth Circuit, is that everything's not in place yet. And so I think there's a little bit of difficulty in figuring out what the actual approach to the administration is, because they've just been getting their people into place and being forced to act with those people not in place. That said, I think, and this just makes sense, Federalist 51 would have told you that branches will try to accentuate their power. And so what you're seeing is a very broad executive power, I think, being asserted by the president, which isn't surprising. And I think his use of executive orders early on, and not so much even his use, but his celebration of it, is showing that he wants to be assertive of his own branch and use his powers to the fullest. But as I said, Federalist 51 would tell you, duh, that's what's going to happen. The real question is, what do the other branches do in response, and are they all keeping themselves in the balance of the Constitution, within the confines of the Constitution?
Absolutely. Are there any other sort of legal issues that perhaps Congress is pursuing that you think would be of interest to conservatives? Is there any legislation coming up that would have a particularly strong impact on how Congress, the presidency, the court may approach issues related to the Constitution coming up?
Well, one thing will of course be if they take up a repeal and replace of the health care law. That will be, I think, interesting, not just from the constitutional perspective, but from the policy perspective. In addition to that, you know, a number of the things people are talking about, tax code reform, immigration, dealing with immigration, things like that, I think aren't necessarily going to reach the level of the Constitution yet. They're going to reach the level of what do the American people want within the confines of the acceptableness of the Constitution. I think it's going to be later on that we'll start to see more fundamental constitutional questions come up. Say if there's a terrorist attack. Say if that something in a later bill becomes questioned constitutionally. But I think we're more having policy debates than constitutional debates among those branches right now.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Carrington. It's been excellent to have you on. You can follow After Office Hours on Facebook and Twitter via the Hillsdale Collegian accounts. And you can subscribe for more videos like this on the Hillsdale Collegian's YouTube page. Thank you so much, Dr. Carrington.
Pleasure.